Thanks for being here with me, Guy. About a month ago, we worked together on the Learn Something New video on some of the fire safety considerations for hand sanitizer, particularly the storage of hand sanitizer when you're talking about those larger quantities, bulk quantities, situations that would more apply to hospitals or manufacturers, not necessarily individuals storing single bottles in their vehicles or elsewhere. It seems like there's some confusion right now that is going on around the combustibility of hand sanitizer and whether or not this stuff could spontaneously combust in your vehicle if it were to be sitting, in a hot vehicle, which is obviously, we've got the pandemic going on, lots of people using sanitizer, heading into those warmer months. So I think a lot of people are legitimately concerned about this, but was hoping you could provide some clarification to the issue. I guess first off, if you want to just define for us flashpoint, because that was something that some people seem to be misinterpreting from the original video. So what is flashpoint and what is it actually indicating?
Sure. So even before talking about flashpoint, again, what we're talking about here is the potential for this particular material, the hand sanitizer, to be able to undergo combustion. And so you need to have three things for combustion. You need the fuel, which is going to be the alcohol base that's in the hand sanitizer. You need it to mix, those vapors to mix with air, and then you need ignition sources. So let's talk about that fuel piece. The fuel piece comes because of the low flash point. Flash point is the temperature at which a liquid gives off vapors. Anybody that's ever tried to ignite liquids, you actually aren't burning the liquid, you are burning the vapors that come off and rise above that. So the hand sanitizer, the alcohol in it, has a flash point that is close to room temperature. So that liquid surface of the alcohol in the hand sanitizer giving off those vapors, they become one piece of that combustion triangle. They then have those vapors then have to mix with the air, and then the only thing we're looking for is a viable ignition source.
Okay. And so what would be an example of an ignition source? Something like a flame, is that right?
An open flame certainly would be a spark from some kind of unprotected electrical equipment or things like that. Those are the more common ignition sources that we would be looking to.
Okay. And so without an ignition source like that, for hand sanitizer to be, say sitting in a bottle in a car and ignite purely from the heat alone, that's a different scenario, right? Could you go into that a little bit?
Sure. And I think what we're seeing in some of the responses to the initial video and other sources is that people are, in some instances, are talking about spontaneous ignition and things like that. Spontaneous combustion or spontaneous ignition would be an ignition source. It would be independent of the flame or the spark or things like that. It requires a material that is reactive to do what's called self-heat. So internally, it undergoes a reaction and changes its properties. And when changing its properties, it releases lots of heat energy. The hand sanitizer, the alcohol, is a material not inclined to do that. So it is unlikely that spontaneous combustion and ultimately spontaneous ignition is the result. The other piece of this is we get into another property of materials, liquids in this case, related to the whole ignitability discussion. And that is, after you have those vapors come off because of that low flash point, you ultimately still have to get enough heat from whatever the ignition source is to be able to ignite that. And that's called the ignition temperature. The ignition temperature of the alcohols are going to be something in excess of 700 degrees Fahrenheit or approximately 300 degrees Celsius.
Right. And so that's why a flame would do it, but a hot car wouldn't.
Exactly.
Okay. And so, there are some things circulating in the news right now on social media. It looks like some fire departments are out there putting out messages warning people, that they could be in trouble if they're storing their hand sanitizer in a hot car. You said that you looked into one of those incidents, and when you dug a little further, you found that a flame was involved. Is that right? So it was a little misleading to read a headline like that.
Yeah, actually, reading the information from the fire department, where they were cautioning you about the hazards of the flammability of the hand sanitizer. They started with the aspect of just being in the hot car, but ultimately their message was, because the ingredients are flammable, you need to keep them away from ignition sources like open flames. And in that particular example that they showed photos of and everything, that incident actually happened because the hand sanitizer was proximate to an open flame, and that was what caused that fire that they were reporting on. So a little bit of mixing the messages here, which
Right.
isn't helping the public understand what we're trying to caution here.
Right. So yeah, it does seem like some people are getting it, and others, unfortunately, there's a little bit of misunderstanding going on. In terms of, and I think we've had some comments on our original YouTube video about this. In terms of how sunlight could play a role, could you, give any more information on that? I do remember, I think it might have been last summer actually seeing some similar warnings out there in the news on social media coming directly from fire departments in cases, about just a water bottle in your car and how the sunlight passing through that bottle, for example, it could pass through the bottle and then be directed onto a cloth seat in the car that could cause some issues. How does that work with hand sanitizer? Is that a concern?
Well, again, it wouldn't be the same thing as a piece of linen or fabric or something like that. Many people will remember taking a magnifying glass and having the sun shine through it and heat a piece of a dried leaf or something like that, or heat a piece of paper, because you're intensifying that heat energy that's coming from the sun. The bottle surface itself provides that, and I think that's what was attendant to those water bottle discussions. Um, but the issue is that the fabric has an ignition temperature that would be lower than the ignition temperature of the alcohol or the hand sanitizer composition. The other piece is that typically the size of these hand sanitizer containers going to be fairly small in volume. And the other thing, if it's a sealed hand sanitizer, initially what's going to happen is that any heating that's going on to the external surface of that bottle, that container, the vapors are going to be given off inside the container. If it's not totally full, they're going to fill that space between the liquid and the full container. At some point, when that container is full of vapors and there's no other place to go, if nothing else, unchecked, the lid on the container might leak eventually because it's not a really tightly sealed thing. The other thing that's going to happen is you're going to start to actually boil off the volatile materials that are inside that, and ultimately probably change the composition of the hand sanitizer ultimately, and maybe make it less susceptible to ignition than more so. So all of these suggestions that are happening in the social media are not actually accurate with respect to the way these materials behave. So
Right.
again, I would think that you certainly should be aware of this material being flammable and handle it appropriately. Keep it away from known, recognized ignition sources. But I don't think the content sitting in a car is what we should be concerned about.
Right. Yeah, and you brought up a good point there about the volume of these tiny containers that you would find typically in a vehicle. And going back again to our original video, we were bringing up NFPA 30, the Flammable and Combustible Liquids Code that we have at NFPA. And when you're talking about that document, you're really talking about larger quantities of this material. And so I think, was it 5 gallons was that threshold?
Yeah, that's what we were talking about, because again, we were primarily focusing on the big issue at the time was the emergence of these large quantities being needed in healthcare facilities, and what that boundary was between following NFPA 30 and not having to follow NFPA 30.
Hmm. Okay. All right. And all of this said, however, I think I think from what you said, the volatile component of the hand sanitizer being lost through that heating process, we're talking about a completely different concern, but it might, it seems like, if you want it to remain effective in terms of killing the virus or bacteria, you wouldn't want to keep it in your car anyway. So perhaps there's a lesson there for people to be storing it in a cooler environment, even though there isn't a large fire threat. So.
Certainly, from a retaining its viability to do what it's supposed to do, you probably shouldn't leave it in the car for extended periods.